Hi everyone, and welcome to this CAVE workshop on note-taking. So in this workshop, we're going to be talking about note-taking, obviously. So the way that we're going to do that is first talk about some of the challenges that college students face and the benefits that efficient note-taking will provide them. We're going to talk about different tools that people use for note-taking. We're going to talk about different note-taking methods to employ during lecture. And then we're going to learn about different techniques to employ while you're note-taking. And you can use those before, during, and after the lectures to be more efficient. So I know a lot of you are probably thinking, I've been in school, I've had to take notes before, I know how to take notes. And that's fair. Some of you are probably have been in school for a semester or two and have definitely had courses where you've needed to take copious notes, but the notes that you're taking might not have suited your course as efficiently as they could have. And in that, I mean that now that you're in college, the volume of information you're getting in lectures is much more. Your professors are talking a lot more probably than they did in high school, and the necessity to recall that information is a lot higher as well, whether it be for exams or for papers. And so these new demands mean that you need to be more efficient and get more out of your notes when you're taking them. And this goes along with all of the different sort of techniques and things we've been talking in our workshops, that this is a skill. Again, it's something that needs to be practiced and improved and needs to be made a habit of before you can get to use it often and get the most out of it. And so that's sort of why we're doing this. And so if you just bear with me, hopefully I'll be able to show you some techniques and maybe some different ways of looking at notes that will make you see the necessity to sort of maybe step your game up a little bit from the sort of notes you were taking in high school or as a freshman. So I'm just going to go over a few of the benefits of proper note taking, and some of these will be pretty straightforward and obvious, but maybe some won't. So the first is to have an easy to read record of the information that's given to you in class. That is sort of the bare bones of what note taking is. But within that, you do want it to be easy to read and be sort of easily retrievable for when you are needing to study or whatever. Also, just the act of taking notes helps cement the information in your brain, and depending on the way that you take those notes, the information it either gets solidified more or it does not get solidified as much, if that makes sense. If you take more efficient notes, the information will stick in your brain better, I guess is what I'm trying to say there. You'll have an easier time with homework as well. You can just go back to your notes that you took during that day and easily find the information that you're looking for. Tests will be easier, and ideally your grades and contributions in class should improve if you are able to employ all of these note-taking methods. So now I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the tools that people use for note-taking, the first one being a laptop. So one reason that a lot of people use laptops is because a lot of us type faster than we write. So if that is you, if you do type really fast, it might be a good idea to bring your laptop with you to class instead of your just pen and paper, if your professor will allow it. Also, another benefit of laptops is that the notes that you take are really easy to transfer and sort of transmit in various ways. So if you say wanted to make a giant study guide at the end of the semester or during midterms for an exam, for instance, you could just sort of copy and paste the information that you needed out of one section of notes, as opposed to if you were doing it with handwritten notes, you either sort of have to just rewrite everything or pick and choose or whatever. So yeah, writing on laptops makes that a little bit easier. There are also apps that you can download for your laptop or your tablet that make note-taking easier, make them easier to digest and transfer around. So those two are Evernote and OneNote that you can use to help organize your notes. And what's nice about them is that they're on the cloud, and so They're accessible for everything that you can access your app on, so your phone, your tablet, your computer at home. And what's nice, so Evernote is free, and a lot of people use Evernote and like it. As a St. Leo student, you also have free access to OneNote, so if you've got it, you might as well be using it. And so, the programs act a little differently, and it might be a good idea to get in there and play with it yourself to see which one you prefer. But both of those are really helpful if you do want to go this route and use your laptop and have all those notes available to you in sort of an easily legible format. And so one other note is that if you're having trouble keeping up during the lecture typing, if your professor's talking really fast, and you, or maybe just aren't the fastest typist in the world, there are different programs to use that will help you get better at typing. There's plenty of free ones out there. Typing of the Dead is a little game that looks like House of the Dead, that old arcade game, where you type words at monsters to kill them. But there's also, sure, plenty of other free ones that are less gruesome. And also there's other cool programs called text expanders. And so what those do are, say you're in a class where there's a phrase that you constantly keep needing to write, and it's taking you a long time to write it. So say you're in criminology and you keep having to write intent to commit bodily harm or injury or something along those lines, right? You could have this program and set it up so that anytime you type in the letters ITHO or something like that, it would type out the entire phrase for you. So it's sort of like using acronyms to type in the words that you need, and so that can speed up your typing as well. And two of those programs just for Windows are Phrase Express and Texter, but there are a number out there, and for all different formats and computer types. So the other tool is the old standby pencil and paper. If you find that your laptop in front of you is too distracting, or you're not the fastest typist like I am, pencil and paper can work well for you, or pen and paper if you're like myself and like to live dangerously. So handwritten notes can be more useful in classes that require a lot of equations or symbols that can be tricky if you're using a laptop. Like say if you're trying to write some giant fraction or something that a professor has shown you, it's not really obvious unless you know a bunch of keyboard macros how to get all those crazy symbols onto a Word document. So for that, it can be a lot more helpful. As well as in foreign language classes, a lot of the times on, say, your tests and exams, you'll need to write out, say a paragraph or something in a different language. And if you're practicing that way in class, then it can be sort of helpful to have that connection there. One important thing is to keep a different notebook for each course. I know some people will just have one giant notebook and kind of have every course, and just when they get into a new class, they'll just add another page, and then they'll go to their next class and add another page, and that can be really tricky, obviously. And so it's probably a good idea to just separate them out by a bunch of different smaller notebooks, and only keep the information for that notebook for that course in that notebook. And the last note, and this is easier said than done, is to make sure that your notes are legible. A lot of times you are going to be writing really fast and need to get all the information down, but after the fact, it is vitally important to be able to read your notes, right? And so a scribble in your notebook that you can't read is just as useful to you as not having anything in your notebook at all, right? So sometimes if you do need to slow down, maybe just write a legible note that gives you a hint at what you were writing, and maybe come back to it later when class slows down a bit. So now we're going to talk about some note-taking styles, and by styles I mean the way in which you take notes. And so these are the different methods that students have taken notes throughout history. So before I get into these, I just kind of want to talk about how you want to find a note-taking method that works best for you and best for the course you're in. And so this is something that you might have to try out a little bit during the beginning of the semester. Maybe you'll find that this note-taking method works best for you in your history course, or this one works best for you in your bio course, and it doesn't work best for you in your history course, or vice versa. And so these are sort of the things that you'll probably want to experiment with at the beginning of the semester while you're still sort of getting an idea for the information as it's coming to you. So to start with the outline method, this is sort of the simple method that a lot of people know and have used. This one involves main ideas and breaking your information down between your main ideas, your supporting ideas, and then the details that back up that information. And so you can see in this little sample I've given you down at the bottom is the first usually heading. They have the capital A, and that'll be your main idea for the topic that your professor is covering. And then the next will be a supporting idea, and then the details that explain that that idea. And generally, as you go further down, what you write will be more. And what I mean by that is your main idea will generally be just a few words, and your supporting idea maybe a few more words. But the details are really where you're getting the most of your information in. And so, say for instance, you were talking about founding fathers that day in your course, and maybe your main idea would be Alexander Hamilton because he was the first one you got to. And so you would then have maybe your first idea be the first supporting idea be the Federalist Papers, and then a little bit of information explaining what those are. And then the second supporting idea might be his duel with Aaron Burr, if that was the next thing that he got to. And you would just follow that method and follow along what your professor was saying. So Cornell notes are another method that people use, and what Cornell notes do is emphasize retaining the information after a lecture. And so where the outline is just sort of the information broken down, what Cornell notes do is have a few added steps that will help cement the information in your brain. And so the large top right corner is just for your notes, and so this could be the same outline method that was in the previous one, just however you would want to take the notes. The smaller section to the left of that is where you add keywords or questions or main ideas that are taken from the notes. And so the only section that you actually do during class is the top right. The other two are after class. So after you're done with your notes, you would look through them real quickly and look for these sort of keywords and main ideas and add those into the left column. And then lastly, down in the bottom, you want to make a little summary about what happened during that lecture. What were some of the key points? Maybe was there something that the professor really focused on? You really want to highlight that. And so if you are using the laptop, there's plenty of templates to use for Cornell notes that can make life a little bit easier. And so these are a really good tool to use if you are taking the notes but struggling to retain the information afterwards. Another method that people use is diagramming, or some people call it a word web or a mind map. And so this can really help solidify the information in your brain as well if you're trying to cover one topic. And so this is really helpful when you're trying to tackle one single concept and then sort of branch out from there. And so this might be helpful if you're working on maybe a process, so mitosis or something. And so the main would be mitosis, and then as you went around, you could talk about the different stages of mitosis and draw little diagrams of what's happening, the cells dividing or something along those lines. And so what you would do with this is in the center of your paper is where you'd start with your main idea, and then you would branch off from there. And a lot of times people turn the paper sideways or whatever. But that would be the diagramming method. And it's probably a better idea to use this method if you know for sure what's going to be covered in lecture that day, because this might not work in every instance for every lecture. So now we're going to talk about a couple of things that you can do to help your note taking before the lecture even starts. And so the first one of those is to do the assigned reading. And you want to be as prepared as possible for the lecture. before you get in there. And so if you read beforehand, you're not going to be caught off guard by any new information, and you'll have a sort of general idea of what's going to be covered, and so you can you'll be more prepared, and so you can be able to write faster and sort of understand more of what the professor is saying. Also, a lot of professors will give their PowerPoints out before the lecture, and so it's a great idea to go over those and just have a general idea of what the lecture is going to be about, and then you can sort of generate some questions for the lecture so you can be more involved and not have to worry so much about scribbling everything down. Also, with those notes or those PowerPoints, there's a way to print them out that will give you the slide and give a little section for you to copy notes in, and that's a really good idea if you have a lot of slide dependent lectures, so you'll be able to see the information and also your comments on it. Also, you want to employ active reading, and we have another workshop about that, and so it might be a good idea to just watch that one quickly to know how to get the most out of your readings. And yeah, so doing these readings will make it easier to identify the main ideas during the lecture so you can focus more on the specific information. Another good idea is to show up early to class. You can do this so that you can get a seat up front. You'll be able to see the screen or the whiteboard, and you'll be able to hear the professor. While you're waiting for class to start, it's a good idea to review the readings for that day and any notes that you might have taken on them. This will just give you, sort of a quick refresher of what you will be covering in lecture that way. If you have any questions, like I was saying, on the readings or on the lecture itself, it's a good idea to write them down at this point and, see if the professor answers them for you during the lecture, or save them for later to ask the professor. And, make sure that your desk and table area is all prepared for the lecture, and, you've got everything squared away. You don't need to run to the bathroom or anything right before the lecture starts. So lastly, you want to eliminate all of the distractions that you might have while you're taking notes during the lecture. If you're on your laptop, it might be a good idea to turn off your Wi-Fi, or there are extensions for Chrome and Firefox that will block distracting websites that none of us go to. You can also make sure your phone's on silent or on airplane mode if it's really something that you struggle with. And lastly, if there's people in class that sort of make it hard for you to concentrate, we all know them, and it might be a little rough at first, but it might be a good idea to just sort of sit away from them during the lecture so that you can focus as much as you can. So now we're going to talk about during the lecture. And during the lecture, you're going to want to focus on the main ideas that your professor is trying to convey. And so, you're not a stenographer, you're not trying to copy down every single word that your professor says, but you are going to want to try to pay attention to when your professor makes a point of something. And so there's a lot of ways that a professor might do this, and you will probably want to try to get accustomed to the way that your specific professors will do this. But some good things to look out for are if your professor is really obvious and says this is important or you need to know this, then that is a really good, that's a good thing to write down in your notes. Also, if he or she repeats themselves, usually that is something that they want you to know, so that's also got something good to write down. Anything that the professor writes on the board is usually a good idea to write down. If the professor pauses and gives students a chance to write stuff down, then that is also usually a good idea. It's a good cue for you to write whatever they had just said down. Also, another thing to look for they're called verbal signposts, and so what these do is give you some either logical connections between information or ideas of the direction that the lecture is taking. And so, some of these can be like first, second, third. First you do this, then you do this. After that you do this. Those sort of processes are things that are really important to follow. Also, if they say things along the lines of because or as a result, and that sort of is that logical connection thing. And so that's giving you a reason why something's happening. And usually that's important information. And also if they use sort of things, words like however or comparatively, that the lecture is maybe shifting and they're giving a counterexample or something along those lines, and those are usually all important to note. Also, something that a lot of professors will do is summarize at the end of their lecture, and this can be really helpful because the professor will focus on the main ideas of the lecture and all the places of information that he or she wanted to highlight. And sometimes a professor might go off on a tangent during a lecture. This happens, and you might not be able to tell clearly what is vital information and what is just sort of tangential information. And so whatever does appear in the sort of summary at the end, you can be sure that that's what the professor was really trying to get across to you. And then, if you're doing the Cornell method, it's a good idea to compare this summary to your own. And if you're sort of getting the same main ideas from the lecture that your professor was giving, then you're on the right track, and that's good news. So you'll also want to copy down any examples that the professor gives you during the lecture. You'll want to do this because the examples will more than likely show up in your homework, and they will also more than likely show up on a quiz or exam. So you definitely want to have a copy of it down that you can reference later when you're studying. You also want to jot down any insights that your professor gives during these examples. So say, for instance, a certain part they note as especially confusing, or an area where students commonly have issues with, those are things you're going to want to write down, so you'll remember them for later and say, oh yeah, my professor mentioned that this was tricky, so I need to remember to do X, Y, and Z. If you're in a class that doesn't focus on sort of equation style examples, then if your professor mentions any hypotheticals, then these might show up on an exam. So also one thing that's important to note is that during the lecture you want to ask about what's unclear to you, but note what you miss. So if your teacher is open to answering questions during the lecture, and most of them are, it's a good idea to ask questions that clarify the information provided. And the more specific you are with that clarifying question, the better. So if you just say, I just don't get existentialism, your professor doesn't have a lot to work on, and it'll make it seem like you just weren't listening to their entire lecture. And so that would be, obviously sort of a little frustrating from the professor's perspective, and you probably won't get a very helpful answer either. But if you were to be as specific as possible and say, could you give me another example of an existentialist work and what differentiates that from postmodernism? I was an English major, can't you tell? If you ask that question, you're going to get a very specific answer, and your professor will know that you were definitely listening to them. Now, if there's information that you missed because you were distracted or you were taking notes on something else, you want to just make a note of it in your notes, jot it down, and either ask the professor after class or in office hours, or at the end when they ask if anybody has any more questions. Because you don't want to just say, hey, I wasn't listening, can you repeat that again? It takes away time from other students, and it takes away from the new information that the professor is trying to give you. So lastly, we're just going to talk about a few things you can do after the lecture to help cement this information in your brain. So you definitely want to review and clarify your notes. So studies show that the best time to review your notes, if you want to retain as much information as possible, is immediately after class. And so it can be really helpful if you are able to schedule time in between your courses to review your notes and give yourself time to help synthesize that information with all the other stuff that's been going on in your course. And also, by clarify, I mean you want to be able to understand what you wrote in your notes, right? And so many times, and this has happened to me, students will jot down a quick idea during the lecture, but then you go back to read it and you will not have any idea what you actually meant by that, especially if you go back to read it a week later. If you're looking at the notes right after class and you see something that says Dalmatian hippo, if you're right after class, you're like, oh, okay, he was talking about the Dalmatian hippo theory or whatever. But if you're doing that a week later, you might look at that and it looks like gobbledygook to you. So it's a good idea to look at the notes right after, and if something is sort of unclear to you in that moment, then definitely explain it a bit more when you do have the memory of the lecture fresh in your mind. So another technique you can do is to create an outline. And so once you've clarified all the information and gotten it squared away in your head, it's a good idea to create sort of an overarching outline that combines information from various lectures. And so you can combine this information from your lectures as well as your reading. And when you do this, you're creating connections in your brain, you're synthesizing that information. And these sort of connections might not have existed if you weren't trying to create this outline. And so, you might see something from a lecture from Monday and be like, oh, this relates to the reading we did on Wednesday, and a lecture from Friday might say, oh, well, actually they talked about this in the lecture, and in the reading from Monday. And so by forming these connections, you're really solidifying that information, and it'll be much easier to recall during a paper or during an exam. This definitely forces you to have a solid understanding of your lecture and reading materials, and so you'll be able to see some of your knowledge gaps perhaps if you're doing this and you sort of are unable to complete the outline, and so those areas that you'll need to go back and study. And it also makes sure that you're clear with the main ideas of both the readings and the lectures, and where those ideas are similar. So this is the last thing that we're going to talk about, and I titled it Different Notes for Different Folks. No single note-taking method works best for everyone, right? So it's really important to find what works best for you and for the courses that you're in. Maybe a math major might need to use different notes than an English major. A computer science major might need to do different notes than a crim major, an education major. So it's really a good idea to solidify this early on. And so you do want to experiment, right? So even if you don't think that a specific note-taking method will work best for you, it's worth it to give it a try, right? If you're in the course and you're in class and during the lecture, and you're trying a mind mapping method, or you're trying the Cornell note method, and it just you can't make it work, right? Then just switch right there. There's no penalty, right? You can sort of translate the information you have from before into that same style, and you might find that a sort of quirkier method works best for you and helps you remember the information the most. So your notes are only going to be as engaged in the lecture as you are. So you want to come to class excited and ready to learn. And I've sort of talked about this in other workshops, but your mindset is a major factor in a lot of the ways in which you approach your learning, and can be usually the biggest contributor to success, or cause of problems, right? And lastly, you do want to use your notes. The students who do take involved notes, sometimes never even look at them. They think just sort of writing it down in class is immediately going to imprint it in their brain. But you take these notes for a reason, so that you can look back at them, right? So that you have a record of what happens in class. And so the best way to get that information in your brain, and this is some fancy psychology, is to look at your notes and repeatedly look at them over time, right? So spread out that study time, spread out looking at those notes, do it every week, do it every couple of days, and get yourself into a habit and a rhythm. And you'll find that over time you'll be retaining more of the information, you'll do better, and you'll be more efficient as a student. So that's all I have for you, but thank you for joining me. My name's Eric. I will be in the cave, so if you have any questions or want to discuss note-taking with me, I am all ears. We also have PAL coaches who can assist with these sort of techniques, and you can come to the cave and make an appointment with one of them. So yeah, everyone, thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time.